For over 1,000 years, Rome was more than just a city. It was an idea, a superpower that forged an empire stretching from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-scorched deserts of Mesopotamia. Its legions were invincible. Its engineering was revolutionary. Its laws became the foundation for Western civilization itself. For centuries, the world revolved around Rome, a seemingly eternal city at the heart of an eternal empire. But empires, no matter how mighty, are not eternal. They are built and maintained by people, and people make mistakes. The story of Rome's fall is often told as a long, slow decline, a gradual decay from 1,000 small cuts. But is that the whole story? We are often taught Rome crumbled under its own weight, that it was a slow-motion collapse caused by economic troubles, moral decay, endless barbarian invasions. This narrative says the fall was inevitable, a force of nature that no one could have stopped. It's a comfortable story that removes human error and treats history as predictable. However, this view misses the most dramatic part of the story. The fall of Rome was not just passive, it was accelerated, perhaps caused, by catastrophic decisions made by the very leaders sworn to protect it. This isn't about slow decay. This is about choices. An investigation into high-stakes decisions that broke the Western Roman Empire. How a handful of blunders, made under immense pressure, created a domino effect no one could control. Each decision was a gamble to solve an immediate crisis, but each gamble carried terrible long-term costs. These weren't minor miscalculations, they were empire-ending mistakes. In this video, we will dissect 5 critical blunders that led directly to the destruction of the Western Roman Empire. Disastrous battle born of arrogance, fatal decision to divide the empire against itself, outsourcing its own defense to its enemies. You will see how these choices triggered a chain reaction of failures, each making the next disaster more likely, until there was simply no empire left to save. Our story of Rome's critical blunders begins not in a palace or a senate house, but on the cold, windswept banks of the Danube River. The year is 376 AD. For decades, this river stood as Rome's hard frontier. But a terrifying force was reshaping the world beyond it. The Huns, nomadic, ferocious, swept out of the eastern steppes. They shattered the established tribal order. Fleeing this wave were the Goths, a collection of Germanic peoples. They found themselves pressed against the Roman border. They were not an invading army, they were refugees, desperate and starving. The Goths sent envoys to Emperor Valens with a simple plea: permission to cross the Danube and settle as Roman subjects. They offered to farm the land, and, crucially, to serve as soldiers in the Roman army. For an empire short on manpower, it looked like a win. Valens agreed, but local officials completely botched the plan. The commanders saw profit, not people. Promised food and support never arrived. They confiscated Gothic weapons, a deep dishonor. They traded scraps of food for children. Those children were sold into slavery. One historian even wrote officials exchanged dog meat for Gothic sons and daughters. The settlement collapsed into a humanitarian crisis. The Goths, once seeking salvation, were now starving, humiliated, seething with rage. Trust was shattered before it could form. What began as a refugee crisis escalated into rebellion. The Goths broke out of the camps. They raided the Thracian countryside, plundering farms, plundering villas for food. The initial blunder wasn't letting them in, it was how their arrival was managed. An asset turned into a hostile enemy deep in Roman territory. Valens, fighting Persia in the east, was forced to turn back to this fire. The stage was set for confrontation. Emperor Valens was not a man known for his patience. He was a veteran soldier, but he was also insecure, eager to secure a glorious military victory that would cement his legacy. As the Gothic uprising spiraled out of control, he marched his Eastern Field Army from its base in Antioch to confront the threat. But he was not alone. He had sent word to his nephew, Gratian, the Emperor of the West. Gratian had just won a major victory against another Germanic tribe near the Rhine, and was now marching his own veteran legions eastward to assist. The sensible plan was to wait for Gratian's forces to arrive. The combined strength of both armies would have been overwhelming, ensuring a decisive Roman victory. But Valens was tempted by pride. His scouts reported that the Gothic force was smaller than it actually was, perhaps only 10,000 strong. His courtiers and flatterers whispered in his ear, urging him to seize the glory for himself before Gratian could arrive and share in the triumph. Why wait for his nephew, they argued, when he could crush the barbarians on his own? The desire to win a solo victory, to be the sole savior of the province, clouded his judgment. He ignored the cautious advice of his more experienced generals. Valens saw a chance to put a swift and glorious end to the Gothic problem, and he decided to take it. He would not wait. On the scorching hot morning of August 9th, 378 AD, Valens marched his army out of the city of Adrianople. His soldiers were tired and thirsty, having been force-marched for miles under the brutal summer sun. They arrived at the Gothic camp, which was a defensive circle of wagons known as a lager, to find a scene of chaos. The Goths, led by their chieftain Fritigern, were not fully prepared. Fritigern sent envoys to delay the Romans, feigning a desire to negotiate while frantically trying to recall his cavalry, which was away foraging. Valens, overconfident and impatient, saw the disorganized camp and believed victory was within his grasp. He rejected the negotiations and ordered the attack. The battle began poorly for the Romans. Their lines were disorganized from the march, and the attack was piecemeal. Still, the immense discipline of the Roman legions began to tell. They pushed the Gothic infantry back against their wagon circle, and for a moment it seemed as though Valens' gamble might just pay off. The Romans were on the verge of breaking through. But then, at the most critical moment, the sky was darkened by a cloud of dust on the horizon. It was the Gothic cavalry, returning at full charge. They had answered Fritigern's call. They didn't just return. They descended like an avalanche onto the Roman army's exposed left flank. The arrival of the Gothic horsemen was the turning point. They smashed into the Roman lines with devastating force, shattering the legion's cohesion. The Roman cavalry, already outnumbered and outmatched, was the first to break and flee. This left the Roman infantry, the pride of the empire, completely exposed and surrounded. The battle turned from a pitched fight into a slaughter. The legions, once masters of the battlefield, were now trapped. They were packed so tightly together, they could barely lift their arms to swing their swords. They could barely use their shields. They were a helpless mass of men, pinned from the front by the Gothic infantry, torn apart from the sides and rear by the relentless cavalry. The slaughter was unprecedented. The elite core of the Eastern Roman army was annihilated. Two-thirds of the force, perhaps 20,000 veterans, lay dead. 35 high-ranking tribunes were killed, and most devastatingly, the Emperor Valens himself. He was struck by an arrow and his body was never found. In a single afternoon, an emperor and his entire field army had been wiped from existence. Adrianople was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological catastrophe. For centuries, the Roman legions had been the symbol of invincibility. Adrianople shattered that myth forever. It proved a barbarian army could utterly destroy a Roman field army. The loss of veteran troops was a blow the army could never recover from. With the Eastern army gone, nothing stopped the Goths from plundering the Balkans. They roamed freely, sacking towns and cities up to the walls of Constantinople. Theodosius had no army to stop them. He was forced to do the unthinkable. In 382 AD, he signed a treaty letting the Goths settle as an autonomous nation under their own kings. They became a kingdom within the empire. Rome was no longer dictating terms. It had to negotiate for its survival. The catastrophe at Adrianople was a symptom of a much deeper problem. The Roman Empire was simply too vast, its frontiers too long, its enemies too numerous for one man to govern effectively. The crisis on the Danube had proven an emperor could be bogged down fighting in Persia while a disaster erupted 1,000 miles away in the Balkans. For centuries, Rome had struggled with this issue. The empire's scale made communication slow, response times even slower. A message from the Rhine to Rome could take weeks, and by the time orders returned, the situation could have changed completely, making commands useless. This wasn't new. By the 3rd century, Diocletian recognized one ruler couldn't govern it alone. He created the Tetrarchy, 4 emperors ruling from different regional capitals to manage the sprawling state. The system didn't last, but the idea did: divide to govern. In the 4th century, appointing co-emperors became common practice. Co-emperors were often a trusted brother or son, each ruling one half, while the other handled the rest. It was practical, localized, rapid responses to military threats. But these divisions were meant to be temporary, administrative conveniences, not a permanent split. The empire was still seen as one, managed by 2 cooperating imperial courts. The system relied on goodwill and close cooperation. But after Emperor Theodosius I died in 395 AD, the temporary arrangement became permanent. In his will, he bequeathed the empire to his 2 young sons, Honorius, west from Italy, Arcadius, east from Constantinople. This was the second great blunder. This time there would be no reunification. The split became permanent, institutionalized, final. What was once pragmatic became a deep, unbridgeable political chasm. The 2 halves set on separate paths, destinies no longer intertwined. They would become rivals, not partners, a decision that fatally weakened the West. With the permanent split in 395 AD, the Roman world was no longer a single entity with 2 administrative centers. It became 2 separate states, each with its own emperor, its own court, its own bureaucracy, and increasingly, its own agenda. The spirit of cooperation that had defined previous co-reigns evaporated, replaced by suspicion, jealousy, and outright hostility. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered on the magnificent and heavily fortified city of Constantinople, was by far the wealthier and more populous of the 2 halves. It controlled the prosperous province of Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant. These regions were urbanized, commercially vibrant, and had a much larger tax base. The Western Roman Empire, by contrast, was in a much more precarious position. It was more rural, its economy was less dynamic, and it had been hit much harder by centuries of civil wars and barbarian incursions along its long frontiers of the Rhine and Danube. Its tax base was shrinking as wealthy landowners found ways to evade their obligations. The West was asset-rich in land, but increasingly cash-poor. It simply did not have the financial resources to maintain the vast military machine required to defend its sprawling, porous borders. This economic disparity created a fatal imbalance. The Eastern emperors and their advisors in Constantinople began to see the West not as their other half, but as a failing, resource-draining liability. The Eastern court adopted a policy of deflection, often paying off barbarian invaders like the Huns and Goths to move on and become the West's problem. The most immediate and catastrophic consequence of this new rivalry was the hoarding of resources. The East, with its vast wealth and more secure position, began to jealously guard its assets. The flow of tax revenue, which had once moved across the empire to where it was most needed, now stopped dead at the new border. The gold of Egypt and Syria stayed in Constantinople, funding the Eastern Army and its grand building projects. The West was left to fend for itself with a rapidly dwindling budget. This military selfishness proved to be the West's death sentence. Both halves of the empire recruited soldiers from the same pool of manpower, often from the hardy peasant populations of the Balkans. But now, the Eastern Court made sure that the best and most numerous recruits were funneled into its own field armies. The Western Empire was consistently denied access to these vital recruiting grounds. When the Western Court would send requests for military aid to deal with a crisis, the response from Constantinople was often slow, inadequate, or simply non-existent. The Eastern Court placated him by making him a master of soldiers and effectively pointing him towards Italy. They turned a problem for the East into a dagger aimed at the heart of the West. Throughout the early 5th century, the Western Empire was forced to fight a multi-front war against waves of invaders with an army that was a shadow of its former self. The institutionalization of the divide was a self-inflicted wound from which Rome would never recover. It created a zero-sum game where one half's gain was the other's loss. The West was left isolated, underfunded, and undermanned. It was starved of the resources it needed to survive, not just by its enemies, but by its own kin. This blunder set the stage for the next fatal error, desperately trying to fill the ranks of its depleted army by outsourcing its defense to the very people it was supposed to be fighting. The decisions made at Adrianople and the subsequent split of the empire created a perfect storm for the Western Roman military. The catastrophic loss of the Eastern Field Army in 378 AD was a wound that never healed. That single afternoon of battle erased tens of thousands of highly trained professional soldiers. These men embodied generations of Roman military tradition and discipline. They could not be easily replaced. Compounding this crisis was the institutional divide. The wealthier Eastern Empire controlled the most fertile recruiting grounds. With Constantinople hoarding manpower, the West was left desperately short-handed. It faced immense pressure along the Rhine and the Danube frontiers, but lacked citizens willing or able to fill the ranks. The traditional Roman citizen soldier was fading into memory. For centuries, Rome absorbed barbarians into its army on Roman terms. Individual recruits or small groups were integrated into existing Roman units. They learned Latin. They swore a direct oath to the emperor. Over a career, they became Romanized. They were Romans of Frankish or Gothic descent. This system refreshed the army and assimilated potential foes. But integration was slow, and Rome no longer had the luxury of time. The late 4th and early 5th centuries demanded a faster, desperate solution. With no time to raise new legions and the East refusing meaningful aid, Western emperors turned to a radical alternative. If they couldn't recruit individuals to become Romans, they hired entire barbarian peoples to fight for Rome. This wasn't integration anymore. This was outsourcing. This new policy centered on the concept of foederati, or federates. The term came from foedus, the Latin word for a treaty. The Roman state would sign treaties with entire Germanic tribes, such as the Goths, Franks, Vandals. In exchange for large payments of gold, food supplies, rights to settle on Roman land, these tribes would agree to fight for the empire as allied military forces. It was essentially a grand-scale mercenary contract. Instead of hiring individual soldiers, Rome was now hiring entire armies, complete with their own kings, command structures, cultural identities. This was a devil's bargain. The key difference between the federati and the old system was loyalty. A traditional recruit swore a personal oath to the emperor. His loyalty was to the Roman state. A Goth fighting as a federate soldier, however, swore no such oath. His loyalty was to his tribal king or chieftain. He fought for Rome only because his king was being paid by Rome. The emperor was not his commander-in-chief. He was merely a paymaster. This created a dangerous buffer between the Roman government and the very soldiers tasked with defending it. This system created what was effectively a shadow army within the empire. These federate warbands were allowed to operate as semi-autonomous units, retaining their own languages, laws, leadership. The most famous example of this policy's danger was Alaric the Goth. After Adrianople, his people had been settled in the Balkans as federati. For years, he served the empire, but he was constantly seeking better terms, more land, more titles for himself and his people. He was a Roman general, but he was also a Gothic king, and his loyalty was always divided. When he felt the Roman government was not giving him his due, he had no problem turning his army against his supposed masters. The policy of using foederati had not solved the barbarian problem. It had simply invited it inside the gates and put it on the payroll. The reliance on foederati had a corrosive effect on what was left of the traditional Roman army. As more and more of the empire's defense was outsourced to Germanic war bands, the Western government began to neglect its own military institutions. The remaining Roman field units were often underfunded, undermanned, and demoralized. They saw that the best equipment, the highest pay, and the emperor's favor often went to the more prestigious and powerful Federate contingents, not to the loyal Roman soldiers. This created a vicious cycle. As the Federate armies grew in power and influence, the regular Roman army withered. Soon, the foederati were no longer just a part of the Western Roman army. They were the Western Roman army. The most powerful figures in the Western Empire were no longer Roman senators or emperors, but barbarian kings with Roman titles, like the Vandal Stilicho or the Goth Ricimer. These men were called Master of the Soldiers, and they became the true power behind the throne. The ultimate flaw in this strategy was its reliance on a steady flow of cash. The loyalty of the Federate armies was purely transactional. It lasted only as long as the gold and grain kept coming from the imperial treasury. But the Western Empire was going broke. As tax revenues from lost provinces like Gaul and Spain dried up, the government found it increasingly difficult to meet its payroll. This led to the ultimate betrayal. When the treasury was empty, the Federate armies simply took what they believed they were owed. In 410 AD, Alaric and his Visigoths, frustrated by years of broken promises and political maneuvering, marched on Rome and sacked the city. This was not an invasion by an external enemy. It was a violent contract dispute carried out by the empire's own chief military contractor. The outsourcing of defense had failed in the most spectacular way imaginable. Rome had hired an army to protect itself, but by creating a force with no loyalty to the state, it had only succeeded in creating the very instrument of its own humiliation and destruction. By the dawn of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was fighting for its life. Its armies were no longer Roman, but a patchwork of unreliable Federate war bands. Its government was paralyzed by the bitter rivalry with the East, and its most powerful general, the Vandal Stilicho, was juggling multiple crises at once. Alaric and his Visigoths were rampaging through the Balkans and threatening to invade Italy itself. At the same time, another Gothic warlord, Radagaisus, was gathering a massive confederation of tribes to pour into Italy from the north. The heart of the empire was threatened from two directions. Stilicho knew his forces were stretched dangerously thin. He simply did not have enough soldiers to defend every frontier and also protect Italy. He had to make a decision. To Stilicho, the defense of Italy, the very seat of imperial power and his own political base, was the absolute priority. So, he made the fourth fatal blunder. In a desperate gamble to save Italy, Stilicho ordered a massive strategic withdrawal. He stripped the Rhine frontier of its best remaining legions and Federate troops. For centuries, the Rhine River had been the backbone of Rome's defense in the north. It was the shield that protected the wealthy and vital provinces of Gaul from the Germanic tribes of Central Europe. Stilicho's decision effectively removed that shield. He was betting the entire future of the Western Empire on a single, short-term gambit. Save Italy now and worry about the consequences later. This was not a temporary redeployment. It was a permanent abandonment. The garrisons were emptied, the forts were left unmanned, and the border was left wide open. Stilicho was successful in the short term. He managed to corner and defeat the invasion of Radagaisus in 406 AD, saving Italy from immediate destruction. But while he was celebrating his victory, a catastrophe was unfolding on the northern frontier he had just abandoned. He had plugged one hole in the dam by dynamiting another, and a flood was about to be unleashed. The withdrawal of the legions from the Rhine could not have come at a worse time. The winter of 406 AD was one of the coldest in living memory. The great Rhine River froze solid. It became a highway of ice. On the far bank, a massive conglomeration of peoples was waiting. On December 31st, 406 AD, they crossed. It was not a raid. It was an unstoppable human avalanche. Tens of thousands poured across the frozen Rhine into Gaul. There was no one there to stop them. The Roman shield that had protected Gaul for 400 years was shattered in a single day. The invasion was brutal and swift. Invaders fanned out across Gaul, leaving destruction. Cities were sacked and burned. This triggered a chain reaction of political instability. Roman forces in Britain, feeling abandoned, took matters into their own hands. They acclaimed Constantine III as emperor. He took the last troops from Britain. He crossed the Channel into Gaul. He tried to set up a breakaway Roman state. The Rhine's abandonment had cost a province and sparked civil war, draining the West of its last soldiers and resources. The loss of Gaul was an economic and logistical nightmare from which the Western Empire could not recover. Gaul wasn't just another province, it was the empire's economic engine in the north. It was a land of vast agricultural estates, productive mines, and a large population that provided a significant portion of the West's tax revenue and military recruits. With Gaul in chaos, the invaders did not stop. In 409 AD, the Vandals pushed south, the Alans pushed south, the Suebi pushed south. They crossed the Pyrenees Mountains into Hispania, modern-day Spain. Just as in Gaul, there was little to no organized Roman resistance. In less than 3 years, the Western Empire had lost control of almost all of its territory beyond the Alps. Britain was gone, Gaul was gone, Hispania was gone. The government in Ravenna was powerless to stop it. When the invaders seized Gaul and Hispania, they didn't just take the land, they took the tax base. The revenue that once flowed to Ravenna now flowed to Vandal kings. Without that income, the Roman government could no longer pay for its soldiers, leading to more defections and a weaker army, making it impossible to even attempt to retake the lost lands. The cycle of decline was now accelerating into a death spiral. By the 420s, the Western Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self. Yet amidst this landscape of ruin and despair, one vital territory remained firmly under Roman control, serving as the final pillar supporting the crumbling state. This was the Diocese of Africa. For the broken Western Empire, North Africa was everything. It was the last significant source of tax revenue. More importantly, it was the breadbasket of Rome. For centuries, a massive fleet of grain ships had sailed from Carthage to Ostia, carrying the annona, the public grain dole that fed the massive population of the capital city. This grain supply was not just about feeding people, it was a critical tool of political and social control. Its security was considered absolute. It was protected from the chaos of Europe by the sea. Africa was seen as a safe haven. This perception of inviolability, however, bred a fatal complacency. The defense of North Africa was consistently neglected. The Roman leadership took its security for granted, believing the Mediterranean Sea was a sufficient shield. They failed to recognize that the empire's final essential asset was dangerously exposed. The catalyst for the final disaster was, once again, internal Roman conflict. A power struggle erupted between the two most powerful figures in the Western Empire, Aetius, Bonifacius. Fearing for his life, Bonifacius made a desperate and treasonous decision. He looked across the narrow straits of Gibraltar to Spain. In 429, Bonifacius sent an invitation to Gaiseric. He asked the Vandals to cross into Africa as his federates, his personal allies. Gaiseric was no one's fool. He immediately recognized the incredible opportunity. Gathering his entire people, men, women, and children, some 80,000 strong, He organized a fleet and crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. The serpent had been invited into the garden. Once on African soil, Gaiseric immediately broke his agreement with Bonifacius. This was not an alliance, it was a full-scale invasion. By the time Bonifacius realized his catastrophic error and reconciled with the imperial government, it was far too late. In 439 AD, he captured the great city of Carthage by surprise. With the fall of Carthage, the Vandals gained control of the entire Diocese of Africa, the empire's economic heart. This was the fifth and final blunder that sealed Rome's fate. The last major source of tax revenue was now gone. The Western Roman government was now completely and utterly bankrupt. Even more devastating was the immediate loss of the grain supply. Gaiseric now controlled the food supply of the ancient capital. He could starve the city at will. Furthermore, with the capture of Carthage's shipyards and harbor, the Vandals, a people with no prior seafaring tradition, instantly became a major naval power. They seized the massive Roman grain fleet and the naval squadrons stationed there, acquiring a ready-made navy. For centuries, the Mediterranean Sea had been Mare Nostrum, our sea. The rise of the Vandal fleet turned this Roman lake into a hostile battleground. Vandal warships began to raid Roman shipping with impunity. The sea was no longer a secure link, but a dangerous frontier. The conquest of Africa was the point of no return. It was the final, unrecoverable blow. The Western Roman Empire, deprived of its wealth, its food, and the control of its seas, was now a terminal patient. While the shell of the empire would limp on for another few decades, its fate was sealed in 439 AD with the fall of Carthage. As we have seen, the fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a single event, but a cascade of failures, a linked chain of catastrophic decisions where each blunder made the next one almost inevitable. The fall of the West was a story of human agency, of leaders making choices under immense pressure. They were not evil or stupid men, but they consistently chose immediate political survival over the long-term health of the state. Think of Stilicho, stripping the Rhine frontier to save Italy. A logical move to protect the capital and emperor. In the short term, it worked. But it traded the empire's productive limbs for the temporary safety of its ailing heart. The story of Rome's fall is a testament to the corrosive power of divided priorities. The rivalry between the Eastern and Western courts is the clearest example. Instead of a united front, they engaged in political maneuvering and resource hoarding. They sold the empire's future to pay for the present. The lesson is sobering. History is something we create through choices and priorities. Rome fell because its leaders forgot to build for eternity, and instead aimed to survive until tomorrow. The fall of Rome is not just an ancient story, it is a timeless lesson in statecraft and the fragility of even the most powerful civilizations. It serves as a stark warning about the dangers of sacrificing long-term stability for short-term gains. The story also highlights the critical importance of national cohesion and a shared sense of purpose. An empire that is not united in its purpose cannot stand. A state that cannot control its own finances cannot control its own destiny. In the end, the story of Rome's fall is a powerful reminder that no empire is eternal and no victory is final. The world we live in today is, in many ways, a world built on the foundations of Rome. But it is also a world that can learn from its failures. Rome fell, but its lessons endure.